Britain has announced plans to develop a new ballistic missile for Ukraine. The project is called Nightfall.
So my message to Russia and to Putin is this. We see you. We know what you're doing.
Russia just fired a nuclear-capable ballistic missile at western Ukraine, 40 kilometers from the Polish border. 40, that's roughly the distance from central London to Heathrow Airport. And while that missile was still in the air, Britain's defense secretary was in a car driving through that exact region, close enough to hear the air raid sirens. Now here's what didn't make the headlines. That same night, while the sirens were still going off, while civilians were sheltering in sub-zero temperatures, while the world was watching Russia flex its most terrifying weapon, Britain quietly announced something that should have broken the internet. Something so significant, so controversial, and so potentially decisive that Moscow has been watching it closer than anything else the West has done in 3 years of this war. They called it Project Nightfall. And before you think this is just another defense procurement story buried in government documents, let me tell you what this actually is. Britain is building a ballistic missile from scratch in 12 months, with a range long enough to reach Moscow from Ukrainian territory, at a price point that makes Russia's entire air defense network look like a very expensive waste of money. This isn't an upgrade. This isn't a repurposed Cold War relic. This is Britain deciding that the old rules no longer apply, and building the weapon to prove it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what Project Nightfall is, why it terrifies Russia more than anything Ukraine currently has, why the timing is no accident, and, most importantly, what happens if it actually works. Because the answer to that last question is genuinely one of the most consequential things happening on this planet right now. Stay with me, because this gets wild. To understand why Project Nightfall matters so much, you need to understand the problem it was built to solve. And that problem has a name. It's called the long-range gap, and it has been slowly strangling Ukraine's ability to fight this war. Think of it like this. You're in a boxing match. Your opponent can hit you from 10 feet away. You can only hit back from 3 feet away. Every time you try to close the distance, they punch you in the face. That's been Ukraine's reality for most of this war. Russia sits comfortably behind its own territory, launching missiles and drones at Ukrainian cities, while Ukraine's long-range strike options have been perpetually constrained, delayed, or flat-out denied by Western governments too nervous to give Kyiv the tools to actually reach back. For almost 2 years, Ukraine was fighting with its hands tied. Storm Shadow, the British cruise missile that we covered in depth in a previous video, gave Ukraine a reach of about 250 kilometers. Impressive, genuinely game-changing, but still not enough to touch Russia's deepest logistics hubs, its command centers, its airfields where bombers are loaded and launched before Ukrainian air defenses even know they're coming. Then came ATACMS, the American Tactical Ballistic Missile, range of around 300 kilometers, a step forward. But America kept the supply deliberately limited, the conditions attached were suffocating, and then in February 2025, the moment Donald Trump walked back into the White House, the tap was turned off entirely. Just like that. No warning, no replacement, no plan B. Ukraine woke up one morning in early 2025 and its most reliable long-range ballistic option had simply evaporated because the geopolitical weather had changed in Washington. Here's where the story gets interesting. Because the vacuum that America left, the long-range ballistic strike capability that Ukraine suddenly no longer had, didn't stay empty for long. Britain noticed, and Britain decided to do something about it that nobody, not Ukraine, not Russia, not NATO, fully expected. Right, let's get into the actual weapon. Because the technical specifications here are genuinely jaw-dropping once you understand the context. Project Nightfall is a ground-launched tactical ballistic missile. And when the UK government published the requirements, the defense community basically stopped what it was doing and read them twice. Because what Britain is asking for isn't a modification of something that already exists. It's not a repackaged import. It's a sovereign British ballistic missile, built in Britain, owned by Britain, with no foreign country holding a veto over how Ukraine uses it. The range? Over 500 kilometers. Some of the earlier planning documents actually put the target at 600 plus kilometers. To put that in perspective, if you park a launcher in eastern Ukraine, a 500-kilometer range missile can reach Moscow. Not comfortably, not easily, but theoretically, mathematically, yes. That fact alone sent a message that no press release ever could. The warhead? a 200-kilogram conventional high-explosive payload, not nuclear, not cluster munitions, a precision-guided conventional warhead. But here's the bit that separates Nightfall from everything that came before it. The guidance system is built specifically to operate in environments where Russia is jamming everything it can reach. GPS denied, satellite signals being spoofed, electronic warfare blanketing the battlefield. Nightfall doesn't care. It carries an internal navigation system that functions independently of GPS, resistant to electronic warfare attack and spoofing. Russia's greatest defensive weapon, its ability to blind and disorient incoming missiles, has been written out of the equation from day one. The price? A maximum of 800,000 pounds per missile, about $1 million. Now that sounds expensive until you compare it to what it's being asked to defeat. Russia's S-400 air defense system costs somewhere between $500 million and $600 million per complete battery. The S-500, which Russia has begun deploying, costs even more. Britain is building a weapon that can threaten those systems for $1 million a shot. The economics of that relationship should make every defense planner in Moscow genuinely uncomfortable. But the detail that really tells you this is serious: the launch system. Nightfall is designed to be fired from a mobile vehicle launcher, fire multiple missiles in quick succession, and then the launcher picks up and drives away. The entire sequence, arrive, deploy, fire, leave, is designed to be completed in under 15 minutes. The crew has 5 minutes post-launch to clear the area. That's a shoot-and-scoot capability, modeled almost exactly on how Russia itself uses the Iskander, the weapon that Russia has been terrorizing Ukraine with for 3 years. Britain studied it, understood it, and is building the Western answer to it. Production rate, 10 missiles per month. That's not a boutique weapon to be used once for headlines. That's a sustained capability, scalable, mass-produced. With manufacturing deliberately anchored in the UK, development contracts were supposed to be awarded in March 2026. 3 companies, each given £9 million and 12 months to build and deliver their first test missiles. The fastest weapons development program Britain has attempted in decades. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, this sounds impressive on paper, but Britain has announced ambitious weapons programs before, and they've gone nowhere. Remember Ajax? The armored vehicle that took a decade, gave soldiers headaches and nausea, and still barely works? Fair concern. Completely legitimate skepticism. But here's why Nightfall is different. And it comes down to the moment it was announced. January 8th, 2026, Russia launches a massive missile and drone attack on Ukraine. Multiple cities hit, civilian infrastructure targeted in sub-zero conditions, and then escalation. Russia fires an Oreshnik ballistic missile at western Ukraine's Lviv region. Hypersonic speeds, nuclear capable, 40 kilometers from the Polish border. It was only the second time Russia had ever used the Oreshnik in combat. The first was in late 2024 against Dnipro. Now they were using it within range of NATO territory. John Healey, Britain's defense secretary, was in a car in that exact region when it happened. On his way to meet Zelensky in Kyiv, he heard the air raid sirens. Not through a television, not through a briefing, he heard them. And 3 days later, on January 11th, 2026, he announced Project Nightfall. Let that timing sink in. Russia fires its most provocative weapon, closer to NATO than it has ever been used. And Britain's response isn't a strongly worded statement. It's not a call for emergency NATO talks. It's the announcement of a ballistic missile program specifically designed to reach deep inside Russia. Message received, message answered. This is where the controversy starts to deepen. Because Project Nightfall wasn't born in January 2026. The first public signals came in August 2025, when the UK Ministry of Defence published an early engagement notice asking industry whether they could even meet these requirements. The response from the defense industry was apparently positive enough to keep going. By December 2025, detailed classified requirements were being shared with vetted companies under non-disclosure agreements. The January 2026 announcement wasn't a surprise decision made in the heat of the moment. It was a program that had been building for months, waiting for the right moment to be made public. And here's the really uncomfortable geopolitical wrinkle that almost nobody is talking about directly. The timing of Project Nightfall coincides coincides almost perfectly with the point at which the United States, under Trump, became unreliable. America cut ATACMS. America started making overtures to Moscow. America started questioning whether Ukraine was worth the investment. And simultaneously, Britain started developing a sovereign ballistic missile deliberately designed with, and this is a direct quote from the official requirements, minimal foreign export controls. That phrase, minimal foreign export controls, that is diplomatic language for, we are not going to let Washington veto how these weapons are used. Britain watched what happened with ATACMS. Britain watched the political conditions attached to every American weapons transfer. And Britain decided to build something that Ukraine can actually use without getting permission from whoever happens to be sitting in the Oval Office at the time. If that sounds controversial, it's because it absolutely is. Now let's talk about Russia's side of this equation, because the Russian reaction to Project Nightfall tells you everything about how seriously they're taking it. Officially, Moscow's position is that this is Western escalation. Lavrov said it. Kremlin spokespeople said it. The standard line, Britain is prolonging the war, pouring weapons into a conflict that should be heading toward negotiation, and any British missile that strikes Russian territory will be treated as a direct British act of aggression. Publicly, that's the posture. Loudly defensive, rhetorically threatening. Behind that posture, though, is a strategic problem that no amount of Kremlin press conferences can solve. And the problem is this: Russia's air defense network, which it has spent decades and billions of dollars building, has a specific weakness against ballistic missiles that Nightfall has been designed to exploit from the ground up. Here's why ballistic missiles are different to cruise missiles, and why it matters. When Storm Shadow flies toward a target, it flies low. Terrain following, radar evading, slow enough at Mach 0.8 that air defense systems have a window to track, engage, and potentially intercept it. Russia has gotten better at shooting down storm shadows as the war has gone on. They've learned the flight profiles. They've adapted. That's the nature of any ongoing conflict. Your opponent adapts. A ballistic missile is a fundamentally different problem. It goes up, high into the atmosphere, sometimes into near space, and then it comes back down. The terminal velocity is hypersonic. The descent angle is steep. The radar picture it presents is completely different to a cruise missile, which means the same air defense assets cannot simultaneously optimize against both threats. You're forcing Russia to defend against two completely different physics problems at the same time. And when those two threats arrive together in a coordinated strike package, a wave of storm shadows low and fast, followed by ballistic missiles screaming in from altitude, the maths becomes very unpleasant for whoever is defending. Ukraine has already demonstrated this principle with ATACMS. Back in April 2024, coordinated ATACMS strikes destroyed multiple S-400 launchers, tactical radars, a command post, and support vehicles in a single operation. The S-400, the system Russia marketed as virtually invincible against exactly these kinds of threats, could not defend itself. 4 launchers gone in one night. From a missile with a range of 300 kilometers, Nightfall has a range of 500 plus kilometers, with a guidance system that laughs at electronic jamming. Arriving at speeds the current generation of Russian air defense systems were not primarily designed to handle at scale. Russia knows this, and Russia's response has been to do something that tells you far more than any press statement. They have begun moving S-400 batteries that were previously positioned along NATO's eastern flank back toward Russia's interior to defend against exactly the kind of deep penetration ballistic strikes that Nightfall is designed to deliver. They are redeploying their most expensive assets. That is not the behavior of a country that thinks this threat is manageable. That is the behavior of a country that is genuinely worried. This is where we have to talk about something that's hanging over this entire story like a storm cloud that nobody wants to acknowledge directly: the Trump factor. The relationship between Donald Trump's return to power and Project Nightfall is not coincidental, it is causal, and understanding that relationship is essential to understanding why Britain is doing what it's doing. When Trump won in November 2024, every European defense ministry ran the same calculation. What happens if America decides decides this war is not its problem? What happens if NATO solidarity becomes conditional on bilateral deals with Washington? What happens to Ukraine if the ATACMS flow stops? If the intelligence sharing gets restricted? If the political will in Washington evaporates entirely? Those questions were theoretical in November 2024. By February 2025, they were real. ATACMS cut. Direct communication lines between Moscow and Washington opened without European partners being consulted. Zelensky was publicly humiliated in the Oval Office in front of the world.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people.
The implicit message from Washington to Kyiv: you are on your own unless you negotiate on our terms. Britain watched all of this and made a decision. If America is no longer reliably in this fight, then Europe needs sovereign capabilities that don't depend on American permission to use. Project Nightfall is the most concrete expression of that decision, but it's not the only one. Britain and France have committed to deploying troops as peacekeepers to Ukraine in the event of any ceasefire. Britain has provided a £600 million air defense package for 2026, including the new Octopus interceptor drone specifically designed to counter the Shahed drone swarms that Russia uses to batter Ukrainian cities night after night. Britain has invested £1.5 billion in new domestic munitions manufacturing, and now Britain is building a ballistic missile. The cumulative picture is of a country that has decided to step into the strategic vacuum that America is either unwilling or unable to fill, and that decision has consequences that go well beyond Ukraine. Because every country watching this, Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, Germany, Sweden, is drawing the same lesson. If you want to guarantee your security, you cannot afford to make it entirely dependent on Washington. You need your own capabilities. You need your own deterrent. You need your own Project Nightfall. Germany has already announced it will increase defense spending to 2% of GDP and then some. Poland is building what it describes as the largest army in Europe. Sweden and Finland, countries that spent decades outside NATO, joined the alliance because of exactly this calculation. The entire European security architecture is being rewired in real time, and a British ballistic missile development program announced on a January night while Russian hypersonic missiles were landing 40 kilometers from NATO territory. That is one of the most visible data points in that rewiring. Here's the part where we have to be honest, because there's a gap between what Project Nightfall represents in theory and what it faces in practice. And that gap is significant. The expectation, the version that sounds good in a press release, is that Britain announces a ballistic missile program in January 2026. Companies compete for contracts, and by late 2026, Ukrainian forces are firing British ballistic missiles deep into Russian territory. Clean, fast, decisive, problem solved. The reality is considerably messier. First, timelines. Britain's track record on defense procurement is not a source of national pride. Ajax, the armored reconnaissance vehicle, has been in development since 2014. It gave test drivers headaches, vibration problems, and noise complaints. It still hasn't been fully deployed in the numbers originally planned, 12 years. And it's a vehicle, not a missile. The British defense procurement machine is not exactly known for its ruthless efficiency. The very fact that the MOD built a 12-month development competition into Nightfall, rather than the usual multi-year acquisition cycle, is itself a signal that they know the normal way of doing things isn't going to cut it. But 12 months from concept to test missile is genuinely aggressive. It might slip. In fact, given the history, you would not be shocking anyone if it did. Second, the geopolitical uncertainty. By the time Nightfall missiles are actually in Ukrainian hands and operational, the war itself may look completely different. Peace negotiations, however fragile and questionable, are being discussed. Trump is actively trying to broker something. If a ceasefire happens in 2026, where does that leave a ballistic missile program designed for a shooting war? Britain says Nightfall will inform future UK armed forces long-range strike projects, regardless of what happens in Ukraine. That's insurance language. It means they're hedging. Third, and this is the most provocative point, the question of escalation. Russia has been very clear on this. Lavrov said in December 2025 that Russia would respond to hostile steps, including the deployment of European troops and the seizure of Russian assets. Moscow's position is that a British ballistic missile hitting Russian territory is not a proxy war. It's a direct act of war by Britain against Russia. Whether they would actually act on that threat, whether they would actually strike back against British territory or British forces, is a question nobody can answer with certainty. The honest answer is that that we don't know. We're in territory that the post-Cold War rules never mapped. And here's the real tension at the heart of this entire story. The argument for Project Nightfall is deterrence. That by raising the cost of Russian aggression high enough, you prevent the conflict from spreading further. The counter-argument is escalation. That every weapon system you introduce into this conflict gives Russia a reason to raise the stakes on their side, and that at some point, one of those raises ends in a place nobody wants to go. Both of those arguments are made by serious people with serious credentials. Neither is obviously wrong, and the fact that Britain has come down firmly on the deterrence side, firmly enough to announce a ballistic missile program, is either an act of considerable strategic courage or an extraordinary gamble, depending on which expert you ask. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night about all of this, and I want to end on this thought because it's the one that changes the entire frame. Project Nightfall is not really about a missile. The missile matters, the range matters, the guidance system matters. But the thing that Nightfall actually represents, the thing that has Russia more concerned than the warhead specifications, is the signal. Britain is telling the world that it is willing to develop sovereign ballistic missiles, that it is willing to build weapons systems that don't require American approval, that it is willing to step into the most dangerous geopolitical confrontation of the post-Cold War era and plant its flag, rather than wait to see which way the wind blows. That signal has a reach far longer than 500 kilometers. Because once Britain demonstrates that a European nation can go from concept to operational ballistic missile in 12 months at a cost that the defense industry can actually scale, every NATO ally is watching that playbook. Poland is watching. France is already working on its own long-range systems. Germany is rearming at a pace it hasn't seen since the Cold War. The European defense industry is experiencing a moment it hasn't experienced in 30 years. A moment where capability, funding, and political will have all aligned simultaneously. Project Nightfall isn't just a weapons program. It's a proof of concept for a new European security architecture, one that doesn't assume America will always show up, one that accepts that the world of 2026 requires Europeans to be capable of defending Europe themselves. And whether that makes you feel safer or more anxious about what comes next is, I think, one of the most important questions anybody can be asking right now. So here's where we land. Britain has a ballistic missile in development, named for darkness, designed for precision, built to defeat the one thing Russia spent billions creating to stop exactly this kind of weapon. And the deadline for the first test firings is 12 months from March 2026, which means sometime around the beginning of 2027, unless something changes, unless a ceasefire reshapes the picture, unless the procurement gods have other plans, we will find out if Project Nightfall is everything its architects believe it to be. And here's the question that nobody has answered yet, the one I want you to sit with. If Nightfall works, if it actually delivers a British-built, British-funded, British-controlled ballistic missile into Ukrainian hands with a range that touches Moscow, what does Russia do next? Because everything up to now has been within the boundaries of a conflict that both sides have, in various ways, managed to keep from going completely off the rails. A British missile hitting a target deep inside Russia isn't within those boundaries. That's a new chapter, and nobody, not Healy, not Zelensky, not Putin, and certainly not Trump, knows exactly what's written in it. If you want to understand that chapter before it happens, if you want to stay ahead of the story instead of catching up to it, subscribe, because we're going to be covering every development as it unfolds. And if you haven't watched the Storm Shadow video yet, the one that explains exactly what Britain has already done to Russia's air defenses before Nightfall even fires its first test round, that's the next thing you should watch. It'll make everything in this video land about 3 times harder. I'll see you on the other side.